Hi there, I'm Marty Senneker from Alberta. I'm the inventor of the Stinger kill spring and the Alberta Powersnare system, and I'm going to give you a quick demo on how to assemble an Alberta Powersnare, which is a Stinger kill spring snare plus a Senneker Powersnare trigger. Hopefully that's not too confusing. Very simple terminology. I'm going to build this snare out of 1/16 wire. I have my spool mounted on the end of my bench. I have a Japanese arm cutter, which is a very good cutting tool, far superior to the Chinese knockoff model of the arm. This thing has a built-in cutter right on top of the press. Very, very handy snare crimper for anyone who wants to assemble their own snares. So I'm going to pull this across my press. I'm going to pull her out to, I got a 5-foot mark on my bench over here. Cut that cable. And then of course when I build a snare, I start with an end loop on the one end of the snare. So I'm simply sliding on a double sleeve. When you crimp these furrows, crimp them completely end to end. There's my end loop on my snare. Next I'm going to slide a whammy on the snare, and then I'm going to take a, normally people use a cam lock plus breakaway device. I've already have a lock and breakaway put together, assembled together. What I'm going to do, and we'll show this in detail later, I'm going to slide the cam lock. However, this one is a lightning lock, but we'll talk about that a little further in detail later. Slide the cable through the lock, then run the cable through the S-hook of the snare. Next we need a Alberta Powersnare trigger plus a Stinger kill spring and then a stop. Very, very simple. So my next step is to slide a Alberta Powersnare trigger onto the cable. So I'm going to slide my Alberta Powersnare trigger onto the cable next to the S-hook breakaway device. Then take a spring and slide one arm and then the second arm through both loops onto the cable, just like so. It's all in line. Very simple. And then an end stop goes on the very end of the cable, and we will position that so a little bit of cable is sticking past the end stop. Now we crimp it. And now we have all the parts assembled in order. We have, are you in on it?
Yeah.
Is that better?
Either way.
So we have our cable making the loop, and of course the cable first goes through the Senneker breakaway device, then through the trigger, then the spring, then the other spring arm, and then the stop. Very, very simple. So here's a little trick for some people, is sometimes this happens to them where, oh gee, you know, they lost the loop. Where is the snare? There was a snare here, but where is it now? And the snare is in between the S-hook breakaway and the lock. That's the only place the snare is in between those. So grab a hold of the cable between the lock and the S-hook and make your snare again. To such end that we can actually assemble a snare in such a fashion if you really want to. We'll do one of those for you next. So I'm going to slide this through to the 5-foot mark, cut the cable. Going to build an end loop. I build my end loop large on my 5 to 6 foot replacement snares for threading onto an extension cable. And then the whammy, and then the lightning lock. And always crimp the large end of the S-hook breakaway through your snare lock, because if you don't, then you'll have to wash or put washers in. And over crimp slightly deforming the S-hook loop is no longer nice and perfect round. There's a little bit of a flattening to the S-hook. Crimp the other end. Okay, now assembly of the snare. Very simple. Let's slide on the lock first. Correct. And then the S-hook. And then a trigger. So if you're having trouble trying to figure the whole proper way of doing all this stuff, this hopefully will help you out. And then a spring, and then a stop, just in that order. Snare lock, S-hook, trigger, spring arm, stop. I'm going to crimp it. And now all we got to do to form the snare is to grab the cable in between the lock and the S-hook, open it up, and there you go. You have the Alberta Powersnare. And again, to set the Alberta Powersnare, you take a Powersnare setting tool, put the body of the spring on the middle pin of the setting tool, and compress the spring. Run the trigger over top of the spring. It can go off to the side too, it doesn't matter, but the tip of the trigger needs to be square to the spring wire and set full notch. And there you go. And these things are not to trip at a touch. These things are to actually have, they're designed so that the target animal gets caught in the snare and pulls the snare tight around his neck, and the lock locks up very well. And then the once the snare is set on the animal's neck quite well, that's when you want the spring to fire. One more little thing I'm going to do, I'm going to give this thing a little bend by the lock, by the S-hook, simply to round the loop out. So when the loop is hanging, it makes a nicer, rounder loop out in the trail. For neatness sake and for functionability, I think it fires better that way. Fires just wonderfully. And yeah, there you go. That's how you set an Alberta Powersnare.